Secession is the obvious solution for the Ukrainian and Iraqi crises. For months, I've been waiting for our great leaders, in quote, to identify the obvious solution to the Ukrainian crisis and the Iraqi crisis. Let's talk about Ukraine first. Obviously, when people are divided, they don't want to live together. They have different languages, they have different alliances. It is better for them to separate, to secede. You cannot force people that don't want to live together. So if the country, as in the case of the Ukraine, is already fundamentally segregated, the obvious solution is for there to be an internationally supervised election in which these eastern provinces like Crimea can decide whether they want to be independent and align with Russia or they want to be part of the Ukraine. And guess what? We can avoid all the war and fighting. War is the fundamental and worst enemy of mankind, and it creates the greatest catastrophes. And secession has the beauty of avoiding war. And there is no real downside, except for the people that make maps and they have to redraw them. The same applies for Iraq in spades. And something that should have been done decades ago or before we went to war erroneously with Iraq, but since we did go to war, we should have supervised an election, internationally supervised, where the different groups, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites, could decide whether they want to be part of Iraq or not, or they wanted to be independent. So the Kurds could be independent in the north, the Sunnis in the middle of the country where they already populate most of the country, and the Shiites in the south where they have the majority as well. So this would have turned out to be 3 countries independent without all this war and all these bombs, etc. It's incredible that some of our leaders, at least one, Joe Biden, identified this truth and suggested this, and he was ridiculed. Unfortunately, 6 years in the Obama administration persuaded him that the Iraqi policy had been a great success. In other words, he changed his mind. He went from the right solution to the wrong solution. What is the right model for us to follow? Well, the right model is Czechoslovakia. There once was a country called Czechoslovakia, and that was composed of Czechs and Slovaks. Now, the Slovaks said they wanted to separate. They didn't want to be part of Czechoslovakia. The Czechs said, "You're making a big mistake. You're much better off living with us in our country." And the Slovaks said, "Well, thank you, but no thank you. We want to separate." So what did the Czechs do? Did they go to war with the Slovaks? No. They did the right thing. They said, "Okay, if you want to make that mistake, go ahead. We will separate from you." And they separated peacefully. Secession leads to peace. Forced integration of groups that don't want to live together leads to war. And war is the greatest catastrophe that you should try to avoid, if at all possible. So what are the philosophic foundations of secession? Why is it that secession is right? That's something that I would like to talk a little bit about. People derive great benefits from living in society. They can trade materially, intellectually, and socially. So their opportunities are greatly enhanced when they live in a harmonious society. However, in order for them to derive optimum benefits, it has to be a society based on individual rights. To the extent that it's based on individual rights, they will be able to live better. By being based on individual rights, I mean that people do not initiate force against each other or use fraud to coerce people to do things that they don't want to do. So essentially, the relationships are based on mutual consent. Mutual consent is an important value. Why? Because it is protecting the individual judgment of each human being to decide what they should do and what they shouldn't do, as opposed to being forced to do something they don't want to do. That's the difference. That's the fundamental difference. Now, why is it that people are more likely to make the right decisions and live better lives if they can follow their own judgment? Well, we lost connection for a moment, so I'll continue where I was before. I was saying that following your own judgment, you will more likely make the right decision than if you don't follow your own judgment and are forced to do something that somebody else wants you to do or the government forces you to do. And the reason is that you are the one that knows more about your life, your information, your circumstances, your preferences, and your limited resources. There's another reason. You generally care more about your own life and about the outcome than the other people. So you are more motivated to make the right decision. This is why capitalism is so successful in the material realm, because people make probably better decisions on what to buy, what not to buy, than if they're forced, on who to work for, who not to work for, than if they're forced, under what circumstances or under what not circumstances to be employed, etc. They care more about their own lives than the other people, so they are more motivated to think and come to the right conclusion. That's the fundamental here. So the basic choice is freedom, which means following your own judgment, relationships based on mutual consent on the one hand, or predation, which means forced decisions, using force to make people do things that they don't want to do. This principle of secession is a general principle. It doesn't apply only to Ukraine and Iraq. It applies generally to all situations in which people are fundamentally divided and they don't want to live together because they have different values, but it has to be at a fundamental level. The best choice is not to force them to continue to live together, but to permit them to secede. Now, if Lincoln had followed this model, the Czechoslovakian model, we would have avoided the Civil War, and which was the greatest catastrophe that the United States ever had. And we would have avoided a tremendous amount of loss of life and property, something that set back the United States for decades. Now, it's true that the Southerners that wanted to succeed were wrong about slavery, but I think they would have eventually come to their senses, as every other country did, and if they had seceded, then they would see the flaw in their thinking and they would have reformed and got rid of slavery on their own. That's something that seems to me to be obvious because the rest of the world did the same, and the Southerners were not any stupider or worse off intellectually and thinking-wise and spiritually wise and character-wise than the rest of the citizens of the rest of the world. So they would have come to the same obvious conclusion that all human beings should be treated equally. So the same would apply to a situation now where we have, if you have a small amount of people that don't want to have a government, living in a country where almost everybody wants to have a government, those two ideas, those two philosophies cannot be integrated. So what is the obvious solution? The obvious solution is secession. And unfortunately, in this case, they're not already physically segregated. So it would take a transition period where these people that want to live without a government can segregate to a certain area in the United States and then secede and declare their independence and renounce their American citizenship, and then they can be happy living in a country that's organized according to their own ideals. Interestingly and paradoxically, from my exchange with anarchists, they don't seem to be interested in that very much, but that's a different topic. Anyway, secession at root is the idea that mutual consent is the best relationship, is the best principle on which to have relationships with other people. If both parties agree, then you have exchange and you cooperate with each other. If not, you go your own way. And if there's two big groups in a country that disagree fundamentally, like the Kurds do with the Sunnis and the Sunnis do with the Shiites, the best thing is to separate and not try to force them to live together. We do this in the case of divorce. We used to not do it. 50 years ago, I remember when I studied law, anyway, that in many jurisdictions, you were forced to stay together as a couple unless you had one of the enumerated causes for divorce. But the legislators came to their senses and decided, well, what doesn't make any sense to force people to live together that don't want to live together. And that's the same principle, applies at an individual level, it applies at the country level, and it's obvious that it would solve the Iraqi and Ukrainian crisis. So I thought I would put it out there and see what people think. Let me know.